Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. Homer is, of course, the earliest and greatest of the Greek poets, and we'll visit Troy in a bit, and we'll hear about the Iliad. We'll also hear about some of the other important Greek writers who came like Homer apparently, not from the Greek mainland, but from the Ionian coast of Asia Minor. Sappho would be among the most famous of these, and we'll also hear then about the so-called Greek Dark Ages and the development of Greek pottery. After the break, we'll hear about the origins of Greek sculpture, philosophy, and democracy. Thales and Pythagoras are two of the most important pre-Socratic thinkers, and Solon is the fellow whose name is most closely associated in the popular mind with representative government in Athens. So, Mycenae was the center of what's come to be known as Mycenaean Civilization, or the civilization of the Late Bronze Age, essentially the late second millennium, on the mainland of Greece. But there were many other important sites contemporary with Mycenae, and Tiryns, the ruins of which you see in this picture, was one such place, about 10 miles south of Mycenae near the coast. Perseus, the traditional founder of Mycenae, is also sometimes said to have founded it, though sometimes Proteus, the brother of Perseus' wicked grandfather Achilles, is given credit. In any case, it is also closely associated with Heracles, or Hercules as the Romans called him. It was for King Eurystheus of Tiryns that he performed his famous 12 labors as penance for having killed his own children in a fit with which he was afflicted by Hera, who was angry because Hercules was the illegitimate son of her husband, Zeus. Here you can see one of the approaches to the citadel and one of the massive Cyclopean walls, as they're called, because they were thought to have been built with the aid of the Cyclopes. Hercules' first labor required him to kill the Nemean lion, which had an impenetrable skin, so he strangled it. He then wore the skin as armor, and it is often used to identify him in the manner of an attribute. How he got the impenetrable skin off the lion isn't made clear in our sources, but he then, in any case, went on to kill the Erymanthian boar, which scared Eurystheus so much he had to hide in a big jar. Hercules had to steal the girdle from the queen of the Amazons. He had to get the golden apples of the Hesperides, and since only Atlas knew where they were, he had to hold up the world while Atlas went to get them. Here you can see part of the most famous part of the complex at Tiryns, the Corbel vaulted gallery about 15 feet high. A corbelled vault is formed when you lean the sides in until they just hit one another. There's no true arch. As his last labor, Hercules had to bring Cerberus, the three-headed watchdog of Hades, to the upper world, and his success at this, his descent to hell and return to earth, helped make him a figure of some religious consequence. There's a suggestion of death and rebirth in this, I suppose. Back in the 1920s, the American archaeologist Dorothy Burr discovered a tomb at Dendra, about 7 miles from Mycenae, and this suit of bronze armor was found in it. Since nothing like this has been found anywhere else, and nothing like it is mentioned in the Iliad, for example, it was at first taken for the armor of some crusader who'd lost his way. But it's now thought to be certainly Mycenaean in date. The boar's tusk helmet, in fact, was apparently a rather common kind of headwear for the day. Homer says Odysseus wore one. And this ivory head from Mycenae is wearing one also. It may be that the bronze armor was meant to be worn only in death. It doesn't seem likely that anyone could have actually gone into battle wearing it. It would have been like trying to fight with a short, tight skirt on, I think. This necklace was also found by Dorothy Burr at Dendra, along with a lot of other stuff, now in the National Museum in Athens. I mentioned earlier that rosettes, especially blue ones, are used in association with funerals and burials and things like that. And this is another example of that, although the necklace is gold. Among the most famous of all Mycenaean age relics are the Vaphio cups found by the Greek archaeologist Christos Suntas in 1889 at Vaphio near Sparta and now in the Athens National Archaeological Museum. These are as big as soup bowls and made of solid gold. They are both decorated with what seem to be something like Minoan-style bullfighting, and the figures are wasp-waisted, which also reminds one of Crete, so it's not unlikely that they are imports. The subjects actually are probably meant to show not the kind of acrobatic stunt we saw in the bull-leaping fresco at Knossos, but rather the capture, or attempt to capture, it's not going so well at this point, of wild bulls, which were, however, perhaps meant to be used in that kind of performance. This fellow has now succeeded in corralling his bull and is tying him up. On this map, now, you can see some of the places we've been talking about, and at the northwest corner of what's now Turkey, you can see the location of ancient Troy, and regardless of what you think of the historical value of the Iliad, there's no doubt that by the time of the classic period in Greek history, everyone believed that this was where the war that gave Homer his subject was fought. Until 1870, however, no one in modern times anyway had ever found anything in that neighborhood which was at all consistent with the existence of a city of the sort Homer describes, and a fortiori no one had ever found anything that clearly suggested to anyone that the Trojan War, as Homer describes it, was history. Now, Heinrich Schliemann, whom we've also heard of in connection with Mycenae, certainly found a very interesting archaeological site which no one else thought was there, but the connection between what he found and the Iliad is not at all as clear as many otherwise responsible scholars seem to think. Here's an old black and white photo of some of the stuff Schliemann found. The collection was taken off by the Russians at the end of World War II from Berlin and is now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow pending the disposition of claims for it from Germany, Greece, and Turkey that are not likely to be resolved within the lifetime of anyone listening to this lecture. Schliemann's importance in the history of archaeology and especially to the popularization of it can hardly be overestimated, but many of the claims he made and conclusions he reached about what he found had to be modified very soon as a result of the work done by his colleague Wilhelm Dorpfeld and later in the 30s by the American Carl Blegen. Here you can see part of the collection Schliemann found in a picture published by the Pushkin Museum. What he called Priam's treasure, named after the ruler of Troy in the Iliad, is in fact more than 1,000 years older than the traditional 12th century date for the Trojan War. It's closer to being contemporary with the pyramids than with the Trojan War's traditional date. When Blegen completed his study of Troy, he concluded that this treasure belonged to what he called Troy II, and that the Troy of the 12th century BC probably belonged to what he, Blegen, called Troy 7a, the city having been extensively rebuilt several times in the intervening 1,000 years. Blegen did also conclude that this later Troy was in fact heavily damaged by the violence of war and fire about the time of the traditional date of the Trojan War. You're hearing an attempted reconstruction of what is called a Homeric hymn to Demeter. This is one of the selections, like most of the music we're hearing in this lecture, from Gregorio Paniagua's Musique de la Grèce Antique, Music of Ancient Greece, on a Harmonia Mundi CD. This CD is the result of his efforts to give us at least some idea about what ancient Greek music sounded like in the face of almost insuperable obstacles. This is a pin, a gold pin from what Schliemann again called Priam's treasure. and a fine gold cup. And this is a Roman bust, probably a copy of a classical Greek one, which is meant to represent Homer himself, about whose biography we know nothing apart from what can be inferred from the poems attributed to him. His career has been assigned to several different centuries, but the 8th century BC is probably the one now thought most likely to meet the evidence. His poems were quoted by authors in the 7th century. Traditionally, it is said that an edition of his work was made in the days of Pisistratus, the 6th century in Athens, and there's no doubt a reasonably standard text was in use by soon after that time at least. But modern editions are all based on the 2nd century BC version by Aristarchus of Samothrace, who was at the time at the great library of Alexandria. The poems are in the Ionic dialect of Greek, which would seem to indicate that Homer came from Ionia on the coast of Turkey, where many other important early Greek writers also lived. That he lived in Ionia is also supported by the fact that he seems sympathetic to the Trojans, who lived also on the coast of Turkey, to the north of Ionia proper. His poems are all the more remarkable for being not only the greatest in Greek literature, but the very earliest ones surviving as well. There is no older Greek literature than the Homeric poems. It has sometimes been argued that internal analysis suggests a different author for the Odyssey than for the Iliad, but no alleged evidence for this has come close to proving the case. Here's the plain of Troy with the tell of the city in the distance. It would be silly of me to suggest that this might not really be Troy at all, but it should be remembered that no signpost with the name Troy on it's ever been found here, nor anything else written for that matter. As I said, in classical antiquity it was certainly taken for granted that this was at least the neighborhood in which the war took place. But to jump from the existence of Troy, or even from the fact that it was destroyed in a war about 1200, to the conclusion that the war, as Homer described it, was historic fact, something which Paul McKendrick, for example, does, is about as silly an example of deductive reasoning as one could find. He goes on to say that this conclusion is universally accepted, which, if true, just means that Aristotle wasted his time trying to teach us the rules of argument. In fact, about 1 million versions of what the war was like, to make a conservative estimate, are consistent with what's been found at Troy. There's so little from which to reconstruct the Iliad that you can just feel free to make up any story you want. I would like to enter this picture into evidence to further damage Paul McKendrick's reputation. How much can you trust an archaeologist who can't spell archaeology? Not much, I'd say. But to return to the Trojan War claim he makes, where at Troy do we find any evidence that any of the people named by Homer were ever even there? And of course, we can't find any evidence at all that Hera seduced Zeus, that Hephaestus made a shield for Achilles, that Diomedes wounded Mars, that Aphrodite rescued Paris, and so on, because the gods didn't exist, for heaven's sake. McKendrick's logic leads by parity of reasoning to conclusions like, Tokyo exists, therefore Godzilla must have been a real monster. Here now is the plain from the Trojan viewpoint. Will Durant, among others, says something different but equally indefensible. To paraphrase, he says, well, of course, the Trojan War wasn't really an epic contest among gods and heroes. The real Trojan War was something like a squabble over trading rights or general political hegemony in the area. But this is equivalent to saying the Trojan War happened all right, but it wasn't the Trojan War. The Trojan War was an epic contest among gods and heroes. A war without the events Homer describes wasn't the Trojan War. It's as simple as that. How would you feel if someone said, "Honey, I have a diamond ring for you, only it's actually plastic. We're just going to call it a diamond ring, okay?" That's exactly the kind of thing those who argue like Duran are doing. I think what worries people who argue this way is that they think that unless the Trojan War is historic fact, it is somehow not so important, but that's not so. All kinds of historical events and real people are far less important in the history of civilization than ones that never happened or never existed. Who's more important in the history of civilization?
Don Quixote or some anonymous but real Spanish shepherd? Faust or some anonymous but real German farmer?
Graham Greene says that Hamlet was more real to him than Winston Churchill. Mythology was to be the primary subject for Greek vase painters, and we'll hear more about this kind of thing later, but right now I want to show a few examples to just briefly illustrate the story of the Iliad. It begins very much in medias res. Paris, the Trojan, is run off with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and the latter's allies, the Argives, the Greeks, have been besieging Troy for 10 years trying to get her back. Achilles, the main Greek hero, is sulking and refusing to fight because Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, has, in short, pulled rank on him and taken his girl away. Achilles' friend Patroclus is on the right here, and Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, and Nestor the wisest, have come to try to persuade Achilles to get over this. He won't agree to fight himself, but finally he does allow Patroclus to go into battle wearing his armor, so the Trojans will think he's in the war again and presumably run away. Unfortunately, Hector, the Trojan equivalent to Achilles, does not run and kills Patroclus. Achilles is then beside himself with grief and fury and re-enters the war to get revenge. These figures are not identified, but they could represent Hector saying goodbye to his wife Andromache as he goes off to battle. Before his fight with Achilles, he'd had another fight with Ajax, and when his little son Astyanax was frightened by his helmet as he prepared for that combat, he took it off and told him that in effect it was okay to be frightened at his age, but soon he would grow to be a man and bring home the bloody armor of those he'd killed in battle himself to make his mother's heart glad, which is touching in a way, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, Homer seems more sympathetic to the Trojans. They're defending their homes and families, while the Greeks are more like an army of hell's angels with little to do but fight and brag. This is part of the east wall of what is called Troy 6. There was a large tower to the left at one time, you see, with the entrance to the right. The arrangement is similar to that of the Lion Gate at Mycenae, with which Troy 6 is more or less contemporary. The gate had to be approached through a kind of alley that allowed defenders to attack anyone reaching the gate from 3 sides, or really 4 sides counting the tower. In this photo, you're looking through the alley toward the entrance. These walls were built before the traditional date of the Trojan War, but would, of course, have still been here at the time it is said to have taken place, so we could imagine the fight between Hector and Achilles to have taken place in this area, I guess. Hector was brave, but his courage failed him in the end, and Achilles chased him 3 times around the walls before he caught him and killed him. And in this vase painting, you can see the end of the fight. Achilles is not a very attractive character for all his bravery. He behaves like a spoiled brat, and the nicest thing he can say to anyone is, "Be proud, you were killed by Achilles." He really hates Hector, though, and says he would like to cut him up and eat him raw. Even though he gets his revenge then, he isn't satisfied and can't sleep, so he has to get up and tie Hector's body to his horse and drag it around until he feels better. Finally, King Priam comes to ask for the return of his son Hector's body, which you see lying under Achilles' bed here. and Achilles agrees to this, having exhausted his anger and having been told it is the will of Zeus. The Iliad then ends with the funerals of Patroclus and Hector, and with the outcome of the war still undecided. What about the Trojan horse then? Odysseus refers to it in the Odyssey, but the earliest detailed account of the fall of the city is in Virgil's Aeneid, written some 800 years after Homer's time. I assume you know the essence of this part of the story. Odysseus and some of the other Greeks hid in it, and it was left with a fellow named Sinon, a Greek agent the Trojans took for a deserter, who said the Greeks had sailed away, leaving this as an offering to the gods which should be taken into the city. Laocoon tried to warn his fellow Trojans, saying that he feared Greeks, even when they were bearing gifts, but he was killed by snakes and the fateful horse taken inside. That night the Greeks within it came out and opened the gates to admit the others who had not really sailed away at all, and the city fell to them. Schliemann imagined that the horse was taken up this ramp in the ruins. Only one important Trojan survived the war, Aeneas, who after an odyssey of his own founded what would become Roman civilization in Italy. Odysseus, of course, eventually got back to Ithaca. Achilles was killed when Paris shot him with an arrow in his Achilles heel. The latter's mother had been allowed to dip him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she had held him by his heels, so that was his weak spot. Agamemnon went home to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, and Menelaus took Helen home to Sparta. When Odysseus' son Telemachus visited them there looking for his father, Helen, with the face that launched 1,000 ships, was sitting on the porch knitting. This is a map of Greece now, and it's surprising to learn that within a couple of generations of the traditional date for the Trojan War, much of the Greek mainland, including the Peloponnesus, where most of the Greek heroes lived, was apparently overrun by a rude but Greek-speaking people known as the Dorians, named after the area of Doris in northern Greece, but they may have come from some area still farther north. In any case, their success may well have been in part at least due to the fact that they had iron weapons in abundance. Pretty much only Athens was to remain above this semi-barbarian flood, and Sparta and more generally the Peloponnesus came to be the parts of Greece most closely associated with what was regarded as the Doric personality. A migration of some of the more civilized Greeks to the coast of Asia Minor is also often thought to have been a result of this Dorian invasion, as it's called. This is where Sparta used to be, but there's hardly a stone upon a stone of the ancient city to be seen. The Spartan contribution to the history of civilization was to be a lifestyle rather than an artistic achievement. The Spartans showed no interest in the visual arts at all. One day the poet Terpander was performing a song he'd written, and a Spartan threw a fig at him. It went down his throat and choked him to death, it said. And that's supposed to express the general Spartan attitude to the arts, but in fact some of the earliest known Greek poets and musicians, like Terpander, who is traditionally said to have invented the lyre, were very popular in Sparta. If there is a Spartan art form, it's music. What we associate with the place, though, is military communism of a very comprehensive sort, absolute devotion to duty in the state, and the avoidance of anything that might smack of luxury or softness. It is said that a Sybarite from the decadent Italian city of Sybaris once was obliged to eat dinner with some Spartans and observed, "Now I understand why you guys don't fear death." The expression Greek Dark Ages is sometimes used to describe the period of 200 years or more, depending on what historian you like, during which little that survives was built, painted, sculpted, or written. From as early as 800 or so, we do, however, have quite a lot of very impressive pottery surviving, especially from Attica, the area around Athens, which was less affected by the Dorian migration. This vase, in fact, was made in the 10th century and is in what's called the proto-geometric style. It looks more appealing to most eyes, I think, than the fragment of the 300-year-older Mycenaean vase with the ugly soldiers on it we saw last time. But art historians think the latter, with its human figures, is a more impressive artistic accomplishment than this. This is what the Dipylon, or Karamaco Cemetery, which was just outside the Dipylon gate into Athens from the northwest, looks like today, and many of the most impressive examples of early Greek pottery have been found here, where they were used for coffins or grave markers. This is a large vase found there, and which was apparently used as a coffin. This is an early example of the geometric style in Greek vase painting, which lasts from about 1000 or so to about the 7th century. Again, give or take a century or so, depending on which art historian you read. Most of the best known examples come from the 8th century. It's obvious why the style is called geometric. Until the 8th century, there are few figures to be seen, and when they do occur in the decoration, they are extremely stylized throughout the rest of the period. Here's an 8th century coffin vase, which was found at the Dipylon Cemetery. You can see abstract animals used as decoration in this example. The heart of the geometric period, the 8th century, coincides pretty closely with the beginning of the first great era in Greek literature. I've mentioned Homer, of course, but probably a generation or so after him, Hesiod became the first important mainland Greek writer, although his family was apparently from Ionia, the coast of Asia Minor also. His Theogony is the earliest surviving source for many Greek myths, but his Works and Days is very different. It's a down-to-earth account of not hero life, but peasant life, ordinary life, and it argues for a devotion to hard work if you want to be a success and please the gods. It's very different in spirit from Homer's work, in which the common man is virtually invisible, and the gods are only pleased by la gloire militaire. This is another dipylon vase about 3 feet high of the 8th century, which was used for a grave monument rather than a coffin. It has holes drilled in the bottom so that oil put in the top as an offering to the departed would seep into the tomb below. A couple more generations after Hesiod, and we get to Sappho and Alcaius, the poets from the island of Lesbos, and Archilochus from Paros, continuing the steady procession of important Greek writers to come from the eastern Aegean. Sappho's work was largely lost in the Middle Ages, but in 1897 a mummy was found wrapped in about 40 of her poems, though none were complete, at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, and some other such finds have also been made. By the 7th century, representation of figures has become a good deal more sophisticated. The style of this century is sometimes called the Orientalizing style in reference to supposed Near Eastern influences, and this 4.5-foot high vase is said to be in this style. It was used as a coffin and was found with the body of a 10-year-old boy in it. The subject of the picture, Odysseus blinding the Cyclops, is especially interesting because it is the earliest surviving representation of an episode from one of the Homeric poems. Sappho was by far the most famous poet of the Greek world who was a woman, and her most characteristic work expresses her love for the girls with whom she was associated in the sort of salon over which she presided. Although only fragments of the poetry of Alcaius survive, his motto, according to his reputation, might have been, "Drink, don't think." He had a more serious side, however, and made a good point when he wrote that the real strength of a city wasn't walls or ships, but men who could use whatever fortune gave them. Like the poetry of Sappho and Alcaius, that of Archilochus, on the basis of his reputation and a few surviving fragments, is very personal and and even anti-heroic. He says he once threw away his shield and ran for it because he can get another shield, but he has only one body. That reminds me of the Irish saying that it's better to be a coward once than dead for the rest of your life. Something with which Archilochus would have agreed, I think, but certainly not Achilles. This is the mid-7th century Kiji Olpi, and Olpi is a pitcher, and this one was found in a tomb in Italy and is now in the Villa Giulia in Rome. In fact, many, if not most, of the finest surviving Greek vases from around this time on have been found in Italy. The Etruscans and then the Romans imported them by the boatload. This is a closer view of it. These soldiers being piped into battle are the most realistic human figures seen in surviving Greek art since those funny-looking warriors on the Mycenaean pots 600 years earlier. It often surprises people to see how many ancient vases are on display in places like the Villa Giulia, the Vatican, and so on, but broken pottery, unlike bronze or gold, can't be recycled. Every pot ever made is still somewhere if you can just find the pieces of it. Monte Testaccio in Rome is an entire artificial mountain of broken crockery deposited there. In the Florence Museum of Archaeology now, this is the so-called Francois Vase of the 6th century BC, one of the most impressive things in the whole history of Greek art. Apart from the fact that it stops even casual museum goers in their tracks with its magnetic presence, it's also memorable because it is the earliest surviving signed Greek pot and one of the earliest clearly signed works in the whole history of art. The potter was a fellow named Ergotimos, the painter a fellow named Clytios. It is further the pot which is usually said to be the earliest surviving major example of the black-figured style. You're hearing an attempt to reconstruct one of the few pieces of Greek music which survives in an ancient source. It's the so-called epitaph of Cyclops from a gravestone found at Tralles in Asia Minor. This is another view of it, but this is one of those works to which photos don't really do justice. The black-figured style is called that because, obviously, the figures are black against a red background. It is essentially the style of the 6th century BC. The subjects of the vases in this style, as is true also of virtually all of the vases in the geometric and orientalizing styles before it, are drawn from mythology and religion in the largest sense. There are no genre subjects, no landscapes, no still lifes, and nothing that can count as a portrait of a real person. Here you can see a Lapith fighting a centaur. The story of the Lapiths and centaurs was in fact one of the most popular in Greek art generally. The Lapith king made the mistake of inviting his boorish centaur relatives to his wedding, and they got drunk, tried to abduct the bridesmaids, and a big fight ensued. This myth is usually thought to represent in dramatic form the triumph of reason and humankind's better qualities over its irrational and animalistic side. This is a more typical black-figured vase now, the so-called runner's vase of about 530 BC in the New York Metropolitan Museum. It's an amphora, one of the most popular shapes for pottery, and it was probably a prize in an athletic contest. Most of the fine vases we see in museums now were meant, like this example, really to be works of art, in a large sense anyway. They were not meant to be filled with cookies and put on a kitchen shelf. For everyday use, the Greeks had much simpler ware, which is actually rarer than things like this now because it wasn't buried with the dead. It was used till it broke and was then just thrown somewhere like Monte Testaccio. Okay, that's where we'll take the break.